To welcome you to the Jacob Edwards Library this evening, and we are welcoming Robert Oakes, who is the author of this book, The Ghosts of the Berkshires, and we're giving us a presentation. So we'd like to welcome you. And
thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for joining me tonight. I've just driven out here from the Berkshires, about an hour west of here. Any of you been to the Berkshires before? All right, so yeah, you've been out that way on vacation, or did you live out there, or
vacation, or
just traveling?
Drive up.
Nice. If you're not familiar with the Berkshires, it is a beautiful place all the way to the west part of the state, pretty much as far as you can go. I once saw a map that said the Berkshires from the point of view of Boston. Way out there, it just said, "Here be dragons." It's just like way off the map out there. But that's where I come from, and I'm here tonight representing the ghosts of this beautiful place, the Berkshires, that I've come to know fairly well over the last several years. My name is Robert Oakes, and in addition to writing this book, Ghosts of the Berkshires, I've also been a ghost tour guide at the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts. Has anyone been to the Mount before? Are you familiar with it? You've been there, great. Been on a ghost tour there?
No, I was just on a house tour just a couple of weeks ago, actually.
Oh, you just went out there?
Yeah.
Nice.
I don't remember this. I think they've mentioned ghosts, but I don't remember exactly.
Well, we tell, what we do is we encourage people to come at night when we do our ghost tours, because we tell a very different story there at night. We focus on a different aspect of the history of the place. And that's one of my jobs has been for the last 10 or 12 years now, is leading those ghost tours at the Mount. And representing now this beautiful and mysterious place that we call the Berkshires. This is the top of Mount Greylock, the tallest peak in Massachusetts. It's just here's just some, whatever this is, that I saw at the side of the road one day. And this was just outside my back door, actually, one morning when the fog was rolling in. And you just get this feeling throughout the Berkshires of quite a lot of beauty and mystery, pretty much wherever you look. It's a very beautiful place. But there's a strong sense of a spirit resonance there that I've always felt myself. And so for the last several years, as I said, I've been leading ghost tours, and not only at the Mount, but this season I started giving ghost tours at some other places in the Berkshires as well. This is a picture of me talking to people in the graveyard at the Church on the Hill in Lenox. And we sort of leading people around and showing them, telling them some of the stories associated with that graveyard. And here I am leading a group of paranormal investigators and psychic mediums that came to the Mount one night to do an investigation. Now, if you're not familiar with the Mount, I'll just tell you a little bit about it. This was the home of Edith Wharton, who was one of our great writers, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who wrote many books during her professional writing career, about 40 books in all. Best known for writing about the very wealthy world that Wharton knew very well, because she grew up with a great deal of wealth and privilege. She was originally from New York City and was surrounded throughout her life by a great deal of wealth and high society life. And her books are mostly about that kind of world. Age of Innocence is an example, or The House of Mirth. These are two books that she's best known for. She also wrote Ethan Frome, not about the high society world, but more about the working poor that lived in the Berkshires during the time that she was there. Well, one thing that's not well known about Edith Wharton is that in addition to writing these society novels, she also wrote ghost stories during her professional writing career, even though she was terrified of ghosts and ghost stories. And what happened was when she was 9 years old, she contracted typhoid fever, and it almost killed her. It took her a long time to recover from this, and she was almost back to full health when a well-meaning friend gave her a book of short stories that included a ghost story. She read this story and then suffered a relapse and almost died from the typhoid. And she later recalled that this experience of having read this ghost story not only, she believed, made her physically sick, but also affected her psyche. She said that after reading this story, she felt plunged into a world haunted by formless horrors. She became very nervous and anxious. She had this feeling, what she described as an undefinable menace, forever dogging her steps. She felt that there was something following her around, basically, and she became very nervous, well up into her middle 20s, when she was finally able to kind of work through some of this fear. And I think that a big part of what she did to work through this fear was to write ghost stories, to actually kind of wrestle with this fear that she was having about ghosts and ghost stories by writing her own, as I think she did with many things in her life, the things that she felt limited by, fearful of. She worked it through by writing about it, and so I think that's true of the ghosts as well. As it happens, this place that she lived in for 10 years of her life is now said to be a place that many people feel is haunted by a whole range of spirits and other kinds of entities that have been reported at the Mount for decades. And I give the ghost tour there, and I can't tell all the stories that I have been told over the years about the Mount. We do a 2-hour tour. We walk through the grounds by flashlight. We start in the stable. We walk down to the main house. We go through all the floors. And I tell these stories of first-hand accounts. I share evidence and things that people have captured at the Mount. And I let people decide for themselves whether they believe the place is haunted. So I'm going to share with you actually one piece of evidence that I share on the ghost tour at the Mount. This is a photograph that was taken in the drawing room of the Mount. And it was taken on our first ghost tour. Or not our very first, but our first season of ghost tours, I should say. And, it's one of the pictures I show, and I let people decide for themselves what it is. So here in the middle of the room, you can see that people are leaving. They're going into the dining room, which is the next room over. And here you've got this figure in the middle of the room. And the woman who took the picture, I should use my pointer, told us that there was no one standing there in the room. And even if there was, there's something odd about this whole figure, right? This very long, thin neck and this kind of no lower body. And so there's something a little bit strange about this image, right? So many people look at this and believe that they are seeing a shadow figure representing possibly Edith Wharton herself or some other figure that may be at the Mount. But this is just one of the pictures that we show and one of the stories that we tell at the Mount and share with people and let them decide whether they believe the Mount is haunted. And belief is an important question when it comes to ghosts, right? And so I always like to start off my ghost tours by asking people, do you believe in ghosts? So what do you think? Do you believe in ghosts? By a show of hands, can we have believers in ghosts? All right. Couple of us here. How about non-believers? You are certain that ghosts do not exist. All right. And maybe? Sort of on the fence? Yeah. Are you maybe?
I'm
yeah.
a maybe.
And if you're watching at home, think about just for yourself whether you believe or don't believe. Now, Wharton asked this question herself in her preface to her book of ghost stories. And what she said was that actually the question of belief when it comes to ghosts is irrelevant. Because belief is ultimately something that's happening up here in our minds, but when it comes to ghosts, what we experience is not an intellectual exercise. It's something that we have, that we feel in our bones, okay? What she wrote was, I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm afraid of them. She goes on to write, to believe is a conscious act of the intellect, but it is in the warm darkness of the prenatal fluid, far below our conscious reason, that the faculty dwells with which we apprehend the ghosts we may not be endowed with the gift of seeing. She called this faculty that dwells within us the ghost instinct, something that we are born with and that we can actually sense, even though our minds may not be buying any of it. And in other words, in order to experience a ghost, we need to get out of our heads about it, right? We need to sort of have an experience of some kind, feel something, not intellectualize it. And she actually connects this faculty, this ghost instinct, with the imagination. And she laments that she feels that in the modern world that many of us have actually lost this ability, that something about our modern life damages our ghost instinct as it damages our imagination. She said that there were so many things that were vying for our attention all the time. Devices of various kinds, like she was talking at the time, she said wireless, which was not Wi-Fi, but radio and cinema. She called these the worldwide enemies of the imagination. She said that they were hijacking our ability to develop this sense, this instinct, this imaginative ability that might allow us to engage with these spirits that may be in the world around us. A healthy imagination can restore our lost ghost instinct and may even prime us to feel the presence of a ghost even though we may not be endowed with the gift of seeing it. And she called this kind of person the ghost feeler, right? The ghost feeler. So what is the antidote? If she's right, if we have suffered a bit from this malaise of imagination, then what do we do to get it back? Well, read a ghost story for one, right? And as I said, Wharton wrote her own really wonderful ghost stories. Ghost stories express a sense of mystery and wonder, reaching toward the unknown and the unseen. And I would add to that, take a ghost tour. Take a ghost tour. You know, one of the things I try to encourage people to do when they come on a ghost tour is to just let themselves connect with this place that we go through in a way that is not intellectual, but maybe a little bit more sensory and a little bit more imaginative or intuitive. Just see what you feel as you walk through the place. See how it speaks to you. I actually think the dim lights and the flashlight help in that. And hearing the stories, the things that other people have experienced can also help in that. So I encourage people to go on one of these tours and just see if they can feel this mysterious presence that we can feel, as Wharton wrote, in certain places and at certain hours. To reach out into the darkness with our senses open and our imagination engaged, to try to make contact with something that lies just beyond the beam of our flashlight. Now, while working on the book, Ghosts of the Berkshires, I actually found that there were many places in the Berkshires where people have sensed this kind of presence and have told stories about it. For going back hundreds of years, actually. Goes way back into the earliest history of the Berkshires, where people have had experiences of various kinds, or have told stories about these places that I think have spoken to them in this sense that it sort of expresses some sense of mystery and wonder. And so there are many, many stories, and it was wonderful to be able to kind of step off the grounds of the mount and go out to these places and research the lore of it, the history of it, and just be there and feel what it's like to be there. And so I wrote the book, I organized it in such a way that I felt was representative of the Berkshires. It's a place where nature is very prominent. Wherever you go, you get this strong sense of a natural presence. So I wrote a chapter on the ghosts in the hills, places. There are many of these natural locations that are said to have their own resident ghosts. So Mount Greylock has one. Bashbish Falls, Hoosick Lake, all of these different places are said to be haunted by spirits. And then we have ghosts in the houses. Of course, there are many of these old estates. In the Berkshires, you have many Gilded Age estates that were built by some of the wealthiest people in America during the period of time between roughly the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the First World War. And many of those houses are still there. Some of them are museums. And so many of them are said to be haunted as well. So I share some stories about the houses. The inns, of course, there are many old inns in the Berkshires. Probably the best known is the Red Lion Inn in Stockbridge. But there are many, and many of them are said to be haunted. Graveyards, which of course, there are graveyards everywhere. And so the Berkshire is not to be left out. And then what I call the ghostly muse and spiritual spirits, which is meant to represent the long history of spiritual communities and artistic communities that have been a part of the Berkshire history from the beginning, like the Shakers, as well as artistic centers like Tanglewood and Jacob's Pillow and places like that. So I'm going to start off by sharing an excerpt from the book on the ghosts in the hills. And the one I'm going to focus on today is the Hoosic Tunnel. Has anyone heard of the Hoosic Tunnel? Have you been up there before? You've gone to visit?
No.
Yeah, no, you haven't been. It's a intense place. I've been there a couple of times when I was working on the book. I went to just kind of be there and soak it in a little bit. And it left me with a heavy feeling after I had been there. Just, there's something about the story of the place, the history of it, and the ghost stories connected to it that are quite heavy. It was built in the end of the 1800s. It took about 25 years to build. It was very tragic, really. There were many, many deaths, explosions, collapses, flooding, all sorts of things happened during its construction. And many men who worked on it believed that the place was haunted even as they worked on it. There were stories, reports of hauntings even during the time that they were working. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book about the Hoosic Tunnel. Can you still see me over here? The wretched nature and sheer danger of the work required to build the tunnel certainly did not help the project's reputation. To pierce a hole through the mountain meant the excavation of 2 million tons of rock, a grim and daunting task, especially given the technology that was available at the time. The workmen's first solution was to use a state-of-the-art tunnel boring machine, which failed after the first 10 feet. Undaunted, the workmen persisted, gnawing inch by inch into the ancient stone with a pneumatic drill, gunpowder, pickaxes, and shovels. In 1865, progress was accelerated with the introduction of nitroglycerin, but because it was an extremely unstable explosive, it brought new dangers and led to the first widely reported disaster at the site. On March 20th, 1865, explosive experts Ringo Kelly, Ned Brinkman, and Billy Nash set a charge and ran for cover, though only Kelly made it back to the bunker alive. It seems he ignited the charge prematurely, burying the others beneath a ton of fallen rock. Kelly was not seen again until 1 year later, when he was found strangled to death at the very spot where the explosion had occurred. No one was ever charged with the crime, though many workers believed it was the angry ghosts of Brinkman and Nash who had taken revenge on Kelly that night. Shortly after this incident occurred, many men began to report hearing the sound of disembodied voices and cries of agony coming from deep inside the rock. Many refused to enter the tunnel after sunset, and still others walked off the project completely, slowing the pace of progress to a crawl. Though officials insisted the sound was that of wind howling through the tunnel, the men were not satisfied. So investigators were brought in to search the tunnel in an attempt to calm the workmen's fears. This plan backfired, though, as the investigators themselves reported hearing the unsettling sound of groans in the deep, cold dark, which they believed were not caused by wind. Possibly the most horrifying incident to occur at the site took place on October 17, 1867, when a crew of workmen descended into the central shaft. This massive hole, which was dug at the midpoint of the tunnel, allowed workers to burrow out from the center and join with crews digging in from east and west sides of the mountain. The shaft included an elevator with a hoist at the top, used to haul the heavy rock up from the hole. There were also pumps that kept it free of water, and a 1,000-foot vertical exhaust shaft that allowed for the ventilation of poisonous gases. That day, while the crew was excavating the exhaust shaft, a candle in the hoist housing ignited naphtha fumes, setting off an explosion. The hoist collapsed into the shaft, raining fiery debris and freshly sharpened drill bits down on the heads of the workmen below. And because the pumps were also destroyed, the shaft began to fill with water and noxious fumes. A man who was sent down to attempt a rescue had to be pulled up quickly from the poisonous cloud. Once he was out, he reportedly gasped, "No hope," before slipping into unconsciousness. Officials concluded that the men below were beyond rescue and no further attempts were made. Months later, workers did reach the bottom, only to discover that several of the men had survived the explosion and falling debris, living long enough to build a raft with which they attempted to float themselves to the surface before dying of suffocation. For nearly a year afterward, many workers and local residents claimed that they saw the apparitions of the lost miners moving through the mist and trees toward the shaft, with tools slung over their shoulders. It was said that the apparitions would vanish suddenly, leaving no trace in the snow on the mountaintop. Others said they could hear the faint sound of cries emanating from the earth below their feet. These eerie reports persisted until the last of the 13 bodies was recovered and laid to rest. In spite of the many disasters and delays, the tunnel project was at last completed, though at a higher cost in both time and money than anyone had anticipated. But it was the human cost that cut the deepest. In all, nearly 200 of the project's roughly 800 workers died, mostly in explosions and collapses. Tales of their ordeals and gruesome deaths and reports of lingering spirits in the dark have continued to haunt the surrounding hills ever since, attracting ghost seekers who report bizarre experiences of their own. One local hunter claimed to hear strange voices that lured him into the opening, where he said he was accosted by entities that left him battered and beaten. Others claim to have seen odd lights, orbs, and phantom figures, and they claim to have heard the sounds of muffled voices and heavy footsteps along the rails. Some especially bold adventurers have even dared to walk the entire 5 miles of the tunnel from end to end. Several claim to feel as if something unseen walked behind or beside them. But it is certainly not advisable to walk the length of the tunnel. Several trains still pass through every day, and that light you see coming toward you on the tracks may not be a ghostly miner after all. And I have met people who've told me that they have walked the tunnel, and I think that's... So it is really quite something. It's way up in the north part of the county, so up near North Adams, just before you get up into Vermont. And it's definitely worth a visit, at least to get this close to see it. Well, another of the locations, so of course the houses, right? And many of these estates are believed to be haunted. Some, like the Antlers and Ashentully, actually no longer exist. They, in the case of both the Antlers and Ashentully, burned down long ago. And some people blamed Ashentully's burning on a mummy's curse, because the man who had built the estate was an Egyptologist who brought objects from the Valley of the Kings in Egypt back home to Tyringham, including a mummy. It's actually a really funny story. As I was researching for the book, I kept coming across these articles published in 1911. The story was picked up all over the country. So you see multiple versions of this article all over the country. And the story was that a gardener who worked for the man who built the estate had opened up the shed and found a dead body inside. So he called the police. The police called the coroner. The coroner came and said, yeah, you've got a dead body in there, all right. The thing is, he's been dead for 3,000 years, right? He had put a mummy in there with the intention of bringing it into the house once it was completed. And so people blamed various misfortunes on this mummy's curse. I actually think Ashentully is a very beautiful place with a very, I think, a kindly kind of spirit. So I don't think it's haunted by a mummy's curse, but that's the story that people would tell about the place. Antlers on October Mountain was built by William Whitney, who was at the time the Secretary of Navy under Grover Cleveland. He had apparently properties all over the world, and he bought most of October Mountain so that he could build this hunting lodge and create a 1,000-acre game preserve that he stocked with all kinds of animals so he could go and hunt them at his leisure. The house burned down a long time ago, and people say the mountain is haunted, and including by William Whitney himself. But I'm going to focus now on the Mount, of course, my home base, the place where this all began for me. And as I said, I have many, many stories to tell about the Mount. And so in some ways, this chapter was challenging to sort of decide which ones to tell. So I'll share just a little bit from the book on this. There is reason to wonder whether a dark menace remained at the Mount after Edith and Teddy Wharton departed, which they left in 1911. For as the years passed, the estate began to develop a reputation. People began to talk about its ghosts. Some of the earliest reports came from the students of the Fox Hollow School, which was a girls' boarding school that inhabited the property for several decades, who claimed to have conversations with the ghost of a woman in the cupola stairwell in the attic. According to the 1986 book, The Ghostly Register by Arthur Myers, another student said she witnessed an apparition in a white lace dress moving along the terrace and believed it to be the spirit of Wharton herself. In those years, she recalled, There were many rumors of the author's presence. Some claimed to hear her typing. Others said every creak was Wharton walking the halls. Years later, members of Shakespeare & Company, this is a local theater group that actually started at the Mount and since then have moved on.
The ghost of
Ghost?
Jacob.
Everyone else hear that?
What? I didn't hear anything. Did you hear anything?
Is it okay? Do we need to do anything? No? Okay, good.
Hide under the chairs.
Years later, members of Shakespeare & Company reportedly witnessed some very dramatic sightings. According to the Ghostly Register, the company's founder, Tina Packer, described waking one stormy night to find the figure of a ponytailed man standing with his back to her in the corner of the room. After calling out to him, she said, the figure turned and looked at her, and it was then that she knew that it was a ghost. Frightened, she pulled the covers up over her head, and when she summoned the courage to look again, the figure was gone. In the same book, another founding member of the company, Dennis Krausnick, reported a similar nighttime visitation, only his was more threatening. Krausnick said he woke to find a tall figure dressed in a hooded cloak standing next to his bed. He recalled being unable to see the figure's face as the hood was drawn down over it. Though he tried to sit up, Krausnick said he was unable to move, as if something was holding him down on the bed. After some time, Krausnick said he was able to lift himself up, but by then, the vision had vanished. Now, I wrote to Tina Packer to see if she had anything more to add, and she was very generous with her stories because there were so many of them from the years of Shakespeare & Company. And this is what she wrote to me. Dennis was the first person to stay overnight in the Mount. He was measuring rooms and wondering how many people they could house there. As he was working at dusk, he heard footsteps on the top floor. He called up the stairs, but all was silent. He returned to his task, and again he heard footsteps. This time, he went up to the top floor to look for whoever it was, but there was no one. Then he started to get very scared. He slept that night in the car because he didn't want to be alone in the Mount. On windy nights, it was often possible to hear the laughing of young girls coming from the tennis court on the other side of the square garden. And of course, the house itself was full of shadows. Now, I showed you a picture of one of the shadow figures, but there are many that have been reported at the Mount. And they have been seen in all of the buildings. They have been seen in the hallways. They have been seen on the walls. People have reported these shadow figures so often at the Mount that I think of them as a kind of, as sort of an icon of the Mount's hauntings. There are so many different kinds of stories, but the shadow figure is one that comes up constantly. And there was one story that's probably our scariest story at the Mount. A workman who was checking the paint of the stable for lead was up in the topmost floor of the stable and said that he could see the shadow figure in the corner of the room, kind of crouched over and looking at him. And it terrified this guy. And he was a pretty tough guy, and he said he didn't believe in ghosts, and he was like, he had never had an experience like this before, but he booked it out of there. He would not stay. In fact, he said, your paint's fine, I'm out of here, because it just scared him so much. And, I tell that story during our ghost tour, and it's way up in the top floor, so we stand down in the hayloft, and we look up into this darkened doorway. And I tell people that that's where this figure has been seen, but we don't go up there. And that makes it feel a little safer, just a little bit more distant. But this season, in a very early tour this season, someone was on the tour and afterwards told me she worked for a local audiovisual company that do installations at different places in the Berkshires, and they had done one at the Mount a few years ago. And she said her technician came back and said he had seen the same figure in the stable when he was there working, only he said it was in the room that we stand in, over in the corner, the room that we always think that we're safe in. Apparently it's also in that room as well. And so I like to share that with people when we're standing in that room, just to bring it home. And it is true that when you're there and you're in the dark there and you're hearing about these reports, whether you believe or not, I think you do get a feeling. I know I certainly do. Well, of course, in the Berkshires, we have many of these historic inns, and probably the best known, as I said, is the Red Lion Inn. Have anyone been to the Red Line? Yeah, did you
Well,
stay
it was
there?
a while ago. No.
Some
it was-
time ago?
Had lunch.
Oh, yeah.
Passed through it, had lunch there.
Well, so of course I'd heard that there were many stories about the Red Line Inn, and so I went looking around. A lot of my research was online, because you could find some pretty interesting stuff. People report even in comments on Facebook. Sometimes that was that would give me leads. Somebody would post about something, and then I would read the comment thread, and somebody would mention all of these other things. I'd be like, "Ooh, what's that?" And I'd go hunting for the stories. So the internet can actually be a very useful tool when looking for ghost stories. I think of it as kind of the modern day oral tradition. These stories get spread around by people just by word of mouth, and the internet is a great tool for that. And one of the sources that I used when I was researching for the Red Line Inn, of course, were travel sites. Places where people go to write reviews of their stay. And I was like, I wonder if anyone has written about the Red Line Inn's hauntings. And sure enough, I found quite a few. And all of them about this one particular room, room 301. Room 301 is reportedly the most haunted place at the Red Line Inn. And there are many stories about it. So let me share with you just a little bit of the chapter on the Red Line Inn in Stockbridge. It's a very historic inn, one of the oldest around in the Berkshires. A very beautiful place. Perhaps the inn's most notorious guest is the ghost said to haunt room 301, a cheerful little room at the end of the third floor hallway. It is this ghostly resident, along with other reported apparitions and occurrences, that make the Red Line Inn a favorite haunt of paranormal investigators and psychic mediums. A glance at an online travel site reveals a number of eerie accounts that are said to have occurred in room 301, including reports of sheets and toes tugged, gentle touches of the head and face, scratches on the hand, and even an unseen entity entering the room and climbing into bed. More than one reviewer also mentioned seeing an apparition of a man in a top hat. Over the years, a number of paranormal investigators have sought to verify these claims. Berkshire folklorist Joe Derwin, who writes about local mysteries on his blog These Mysterious Hills, once checked himself into the infamous room 301 to conduct his own investigation. During the night, he claimed to experience certain electrical fluctuations while using an EMF detector, which is a device that is used often in paranormal investigations, which revealed high spikes between the bed and armoire. Another pair of ghost investigators, Joseph Flammer and Diane Hill, also reported odd anomalies and unexplained phenomena while staying in room 301. They claimed that a video camera that was left running through the night recorded 18 distinct knocks, mostly emanating from the armoire. They claimed that a camera also captured a hazy figure that moved past the mirror at 2 a.m. and that something, they said, else crossed the room and struck the camera's tripod. The dowsing rods they were using, another device that is often used in investigations, that they were using at one point crossed over a cold spot, and a question they posed to the darkness, "Is there a spirit here in the room with us?" seemed to be answered by knocks from inside the armoire. At one point, they said, its doors actually began to creak open on their own. While room 301 does appear to be an especially active room, reports of strangeness at the Red Lion Inn are not confined to that location. In room 424, for example, one guest reported feeling that something was standing over her bed. Another guest asked to be moved to a different room because of the many disturbances he experienced during the night. Others have claimed to see the apparition of a girl with flowers in her hand. Another visitor said she felt an unseen hand brush against her while walking down the stairs into the first floor parlor. And according to a former housekeeper, much of the cleaning staff believes the entire fourth floor to be haunted. So, how does the management of the Red Lion Inn feel about all these reports? They seem to enjoy the mystery of it all. In response to the question of whether the inn is haunted, they wrote on their website, "After 235 years, that's a lot of guests, and old buildings do make strange noises. So there are a lot of rumors and stories. Are they true? Why not decide for yourself and let us know if you see anything?" I love that they're kind of being playful about it. And I feel like it wasn't that long ago that if places were haunted or believed to be haunted, places that were inns or B&Bs and so forth, they would kind of keep it hush-hush because they were afraid it would scare away business, right? I don't know, would you stay in a haunted inn? No, right? As many people feel that way, right? But I think over time, there's actually a growing, market for staying in haunted inns and B&Bs. I know that the Lizzie Borden house, right? They were, do you know about
I was born
it?
and raised there.
What's that?
I was born and raised.
Oh, so you know the area. And they were, people were staying there because they wanted to stay in a haunted house. We've been asked at the Mount if people can stay. Hasn't happened yet, but it is something that I feel is growing, and that it's almost like people want a ghost. It's like, it has to have a pool, it has to have, a continental breakfast, and a ghost, right? Checks off all the lists. Well, the next section in the book is, of course, graveyards. And, I thought, foolishly, that if a good place to start when looking for the ghost stories in the Berkshires would be to go to the graveyards. I mean, surely they're haunted, right? Well, as it turns out, there are not a lot of stories about haunted graveyards. There are many wonderful graveyards, some really, really old ones, some that are almost completely gone, others that are, of course, much, much more modern. And there's one in particular in Stockbridge where they have the Sedgwick Pie, which is it's the entire Sedgwick family. That was one of the main families of the Berkshires going way back to the early days. They started to bury themselves, as they died. They would bury the bodies in these rings all around the patriarch and matriarch of the family. And so they're in the center, and then you've got all of the various generations of the family buried in these rings around the center, all facing in toward the forebears, right? So it's a very interesting arrangement of graves, and it's not something that you see often. But there is, so this is the Berkshire, the Church on the Hill cemetery where I give ghost tours. And one of the older cemeteries, and in fact this was really the start of the town of Lenox. When they founded the town, they started with a church and a graveyard and then built the town out around it. So you see many old tombstones in there. And there's another one that's really quite special. It's up on October Mountain. It's called the West Branch Road Cemetery. And at the time that it was laid down in the early 1800s, it was a center of a town that was up there. But over time, people moved away from the top of the mountain, and eventually it became William Whitney's game preserve, and then later on it became a state park. So now it's a state park. So you go up there and you kind of trudge through the woods and you find this lost cemetery, as it's called, with many stones kind of fallen over. And it's believed to be haunted by the ghost of a 9-year-old girl who's buried there. And people say they've seen her and they've heard her whistling or singing there. It's a beautiful location. It's a little hard to find, but it's well worth the visit. And the last section of the book is what I call the ghostly muse and spiritual spirits, which I think sounds a little bit like a Jeopardy category. But it is my attempt to reflect what has long been a part of the Berkshire culture, which is these places where people would gather to focus in on artistic or spiritual work of various kinds, right? And so Tanglewood is, have you heard of Tanglewood, the music festival, right? The Boston Symphony plays there every summer. James Taylor always plays there. So that's it's one of these main cultural centers. And as it turns out, Tanglewood is haunted. And particularly this building here, which is called Highwood Manor. And there's actually an interesting history to Tanglewood. It connects it to the Transcendentalist movement, the Concord circle of writers based around, the Boston area and Concord, Emerson and Thoreau and people, Margaret Fuller, people like that. And there were members of that Transcendentalist group who actually made their way all the way out to the Berkshires and built houses there and lived there for some time. And one of the famous residents of Tanglewood was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who actually gave Tanglewood its name during the very short time that he lived there, about 18 months. He lived in a little cottage on the property. He wrote The House of Seven Gables while there in a book called The Wonder Book, an adaptation of Greek myth. And he gave the place its name, so he has definitely left a mark there on the Berkshires. But one of the sort of notable guests of Tanglewood said to experience ghosts there was Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein, the famous composer and conductor, who had a residency there for some years. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about Tanglewood and the ghosts that Leonard Bernstein experienced there. Bernstein himself was said to have encountered the Highwood ghost on the infamous second floor. Between 1986 and his death in 1990, the celebrated composer and conductor used one of those rooms as an office. It was there in 1990, just 2 months before he died, that he reportedly leapt from his seat, threw his hands up toward the ceiling and shouted, "What is it that's there? Who is it that's there?" BSO volunteer Barbara Greenbaum said, "Lenny really believed in ghosts. He really did." She went on to describe a kind of musical seance that Bernstein arranged shortly after this eerie encounter. Greenbaum explained, Bernstein and composer Andre Previn, around the time of Bernstein's death, came up to the top floor of Highwood Manor at midnight to play Eine kleine Nachtmusik by Mozart to try to summon the ghost. No spirit appeared to the men that night, Greenbaum said, but people loved the story. It's just fun to think that these two giants of music loved it and believed it so much that they snuck in here at night to try to make contact. Composer John Williams, who recently composed a piece titled Highwood's Ghost, to celebrate this encounter, also affirmed Bernstein's belief, writing, "I well remember one night, as Lenny was making his way up the first stairwell, exclaiming, 'This place is haunted.' It may be expected that Lenny, genius that he was, might have had a special ability to receive transmissions from the sphere of spirits and signs. Indeed, the Highwood ghost encounter was not the first transmission Bernstein was said to have experienced at Tanglewood. Former assistant Charlie Harmon, in his memoir On the Road and Off the Record with Leonard Bernstein, wrote that the famed musician was noticeably upset after conducting a performance of Beethoven's Symphony No. 3. He said to me, in the second movement, a funeral march, I saw somebody walking across the back of the stage. I wondered why anyone would be back there. Who was it? I asked. Kusi, L.B. said, his face suddenly drawn, the lines going deep. I stopped what I was doing. Dr. Kuzovitsky, who he called Kusi, the founder of Tanglewood, died in 1951. I'm certain of it. It was Kusi, L.B. said. Interestingly, Harmon went on to write that on this particular night, there was an astrological convergence, a once-in-a-million-years alignment of stars and planets, which inspired Bernstein and others to stay up late to absorb this exceptional energy, which was predicted to peak at 4 a.m. Is it possible that on this night of cosmic alignment, that particular piece of music, performed in that rarefied location, conducted by a man said to be especially attuned to the sphere of spirits and signs, may have revealed a momentary glimpse of the otherworld in the form of Kusi's ghost? Was this what led Bernstein and Previn to venture up to the top floor of Highwood at midnight some years later to try to summon up the spirit with song? If so, why did it not seem to work that night? Could it have been that they chose the wrong piece? BSO volunteer Gabe Kozakov seemed to think so. He commented, they should have played Beethoven Opus 70 No. 1, the Ghost Trio. So, just some of the many stories that we have to share in the Berkshires. And I found the process of writing this book just so enjoyable. A lot of it was because it gave me an excuse to go to these places to see what I felt there. You know, there were so many stories told about them. My sense is that people for a long time have had some kind of experience with these locations and would tell stories about them. So I wanted to go and see for myself what these experiences were and what was it about each of these locations that inspired people to tell these stories. And so getting out there was really enjoyable. Another thing that I found was really great was that when I told people I was working on a ghost book, people would pull me aside and they'd be like, you know, I have a story, you know, and they'd start to share with me these stories that were just wonderful. And I find that many times people do have stories of strange things that they've experienced, but they don't always talk about them because they're not sure that, you know, people will accept these stories, right? And so I think that because, I lead ghost tours and I write books about ghosts, people feel like they can tell me. And I love when they do, because I think that these experiences are some of the things that just make life, that give life this sense of mystery and wonder. And, it's true that sometimes these experiences are scary, and I know that people have reported some frightening things as well. So I don't mean to be Pollyannic and say that they're all wonderful and necessarily uplifting. I know that there can be some that are frightening. Nevertheless, I think even when we do have experiences that may be a little bit frightening, they give us this sense that there is something more to life. There's some other spirit level working in the world that I think is good to contact and to be reminded of from time to time. So I encourage people to read about ghosts, to go to places that may be haunted and see what they might feel when they go there. And if you do have any experiences, I encourage you to tell stories of your own. So just to let you know about me and what I'm doing, so Ghost of the Berkshires, of course, I have copies of it here if you'd like to get a copy. It's also available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through the publisher, arcadiapublishing.com. I'm also doing ghost tours, as I said, at these 3 locations in the Berkshires. And, if you happen to get out to the Berkshires on October 30th, I'm doing a walk through the cemetery that day at 5 o'clock at the church on the hill. The other events that we're going to keep doing Ventford tours, actually the ghost tours at Ventford Hall, we're going to keep them going after Halloween. So there will be some dates available in November and December if you wanted to join on one of those. There's information about that at gildedage.org. For the Mount, we end at Halloween, and all of the in-person tours are currently sold out. However, we are doing online ghost tours at the Mount on Halloween. So you can actually log in from the comfort and safety of home and watch me walk through the dark shadows of the Mount and run from the shadow figures at 10 p.m. on Halloween. I actually think it's a good experience. There's nothing like being there, but there is something kind of cool about kind of connecting to it on the internet. And one of the things that we can do that we can't do in our in-person tour with the online tours, we can take people into some of the lesser traveled places that we can't normally bring a large group into. We can actually go into that top floor of the stable and even the attic of the house. So that's a pretty cool thing. So if you want to do that, it's at edithwharton.org. That's the place to register for that. And of course, more about me at my website, robertoaks.net. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions or if you'd like to share any stories of your own, I'd love to hear those. Let me know.
I was just curious about the cemetery on October Mountain.
Yeah.
Because actually, that's where I stayed, like in the campground at October Mountain.
Oh, you were camping there? Yeah.
Yeah. Where was it? Like, is
Yeah.
it like a part of the hiking there? I didn't.
Of course, people say the lost cemetery, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had seen a bunch of things online about it. I said, well, I have to go find this place, right? And so you pull out the map, you try to figure out, it's near this, I heard it was by this reservoir, and then, eventually I figured out that it's actually pretty easy to find because it's West Branch Road Cemetery, and there is a sign for West Branch Road in the town of Washington. And then you just have to drive down the road. But, it is, it's pretty, rough, and the road can be washed out, and actually somebody I know went after me and, totaled their car trying to get out there. So, the way I found it was to drive up to the town of Washington, and there's a main, I think it's Route 8 that goes through there, and then you find West Branch Road, you turn left on it, and you just go all the way into the woods, and then you get near to one of the reservoirs there, park, and you'll see a little wooden sign that says West Branch Road Cemetery. You have to kind of trudge into the woods a little bit, and then you'll find there's a clearing. And there are a few stones that are still standing upright, but many of them are lying flat on the ground. And but the place is cleared, and apparently it is maintained by the town of Washington. Someone goes out there and mows it every once in a while.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Do you poke around remnants of towns? And I mean, you can't go far anywhere around here without finding a cellar hole. Everybody talks about the stone walls in the woods, but
Right.
The cellar holes and that's where people basically put their lives into the ground.
Yeah.
And then they're gone.
Yeah.
And you find little what were settlements. You can find crossroads in the woods
Yeah.
that at one point where it was a hamlet of some kind.
Right. Yeah.
Have you poked around out there into that sort of thing?
In the Berkshires?
Yeah.
You know, think about this. Have I done any of that in the Berkshires? You know, somebody led me to the gravesite of Titus, the man who built Ashen Tully, and you really have to like trudge out there, and it's just 2 stones way out there. But I'll tell you this: I'm working now on a book about my home state of New Jersey, and one of the things I'm finding is that many of the places that are, you know, that the stories are connected to are just simply gone.
Yeah.
They've been paved over. They've been built onto, and it can be really difficult to find. Like, it's a sort of a recurring theme now. I'm like on the trail of a story, and like there's this place called the Ghost. There was a landmark called the Ghost Tree in Bloomfield, the town of Bloomfield, and I'm hunting it down. I'm trying to, and at the end of the story, it's been paved over by the Garden State Parkway, you know, or this other place I was looking into, paved over by Interstate 80. But I did actually have an encounter with a man who was a scout leader at a Boy Scout camp out that way in western New Jersey, and he was awesome because I was looking for stories about a castle building that they called a castle that was on the grounds of the Boy Scouts. And decades ago, the Scouts used to tell ghost stories about it, but it has since been torn down. Well, this guy turned out to be just new encyclopedic knowledge of the history, and I showed up. He invited me to come. I showed up. He's like, "All right, let's go," you know. And so we go trudging out into the woods. He's leading me to all of these cellar holes, stone walls, all these remnants of an industrial village that had been on the mountain. So there were all these old mill buildings and little pottery shards and things that were left of the castle. That was all he could find. But it was a cool experience for sure. He even showed me a lime kiln clearing. So it was, you know, where they used to burn the charcoal. Now it's mostly a burned out circular piece of land. Even all these years later, nothing really grows there.
Right.
So it's kind of, you know, and I didn't necessarily have an eye for that, but he was able to sort of help me appreciate what all these places were. And you kind of get that sense of history there, the ghosts of these old buildings and the lives that were once lived there. So that was pretty cool. Yeah. Have you done much of that yourself?
I like poking around in the woods.
Yeah.
I raised my hand as not believing in ghosts. But
Yeah.
I would think if they were anywhere, it would be somebody who had basically worked himself to death or herself to death trying to maintain one of these old farms. And,
Sure.
You know, rather than hanging out in Edith Wharton's house.
You would think that, right?
That's easy duty for a ghost.
Yeah,
as
right,
opposed
right.
to
Yeah.
Somebody out in the swamp.
Yeah,
which
no,
is-
it's a good point. It's a good point.
My brother's moved out west. I'm from around Boston, but he moved west and brought his family to Bunker Hill,
Yeah.
where they had never been.
Yeah.
And they were like, "This is a battlefield,"
Yeah.
you know. And if there's any place in the world that's got concentrated misery on it, it's one afternoon at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
Charlestown is completely not grown over, built over.
Mhm.
You know, there's virtually nothing of the battlefield that's
Right.
untouched.
Yeah.
So you'd think all those houses in Charlestown would be crawling with, you know, the ghosts of wounded soldiers,
Sure.
dead soldiers, but they aren't.
You don't feel
Because
anything. Yeah.
Nobody's got the time to be worried about that stuff.
Yeah.
guess.
I did feel that at Gettysburg. Have you ever been there?
Yeah.
Wow, that whole town felt haunted to me.
Yeah. Huh.
And you just get that strong feeling of just all of the suffering and the tragedy that occurred there. I mean, I felt it. You know, it's.
Yeah.
But you're right. You know, and it's a good question. Why should we care? Or you know, what was so hard about their lives? Right, these people living in the mansions on the hill. But there were quite a few tragedies in those families as well.
Yeah,
And
well, her husband was mentally ill.
he
wasn't
was,
he?
yeah, and they had a lot of. There was some suffering going on between them for
Yeah.
sure.
Do you
And-
think his mental illness, as it sort of evolved there at the Mount, contributed to
It's a good question. You know,
those feelings of haunting or her
My-
own issues about ghosts? I mean, she was under a lot of stress from that relationship. and
Right.
that.
I think so. And then, you know, I think for him, I mean, it was a very isolating place. And he was, because that's why they chose to, she wanted to get away from the epicenter of high society, which was New York City, right? And all of the demands on her life, on her time, was constantly one after another things you had to do if that you were expected to do, to attend certain events and parties and travel with people and all that kind of thing. So she wanted to get away from that, and that's why she chose to move to the Berkshires, so she could really focus in on writing. So
But everybody else had moved to the Berkshires too.
well, there was some of
The
that,
whole
but
society.
it was never, yes, for sure, but it was never the kind of epicenter the way that Newport or even the Hudson Valley was. It always had a little bit of distance and seclusion, and even when she got there, she built it in such a way that it was way off the main road, was surrounded by the woods. She even turned the house around so that the main entrance really is the part that faces the garden, and the back, what feels like the back, is actually the front face. And there's this feeling that you have to kind of make your way in. You don't just walk into her house. You have to be expected. You have to be approved of, and all this sort of thing. So she was very private. And anyway, I think he was actually very sociable and seemed to enjoy being around everybody and all the parties and gatherings. So it may not have been the best place for him as his mental health was declining. It may have contributed to it. I don't know. At the time, there's very little understanding of mental illness back then, and there was a lot of denial about what he was experiencing. There wasn't any real official diagnosis, but today we think he may have had bipolar disease, but there was really nothing for him at that time.
Now they blamed the person.
Yeah.
So it was looked at as a moral.
I think so. I think, and there was just oh, not us. We don't have those problems. That kind of thing. Yeah. So, it's everywhere. These things, happen. Sarah Morgan, who built Benford Hall with her husband George. I mean, she died just a few years after she built it of a heart condition, and it was very sad, very tragic. She finally built the house of her dreams and then died. So many people believe that she haunts the house and trying to, and that when there are parties and dinner gatherings there, they feel that her spirit becomes awakened by that because she wants to be a part of that, so, yeah.
It was a big business after the Civil War to contact the dead. You could make a lot of money
That's
claiming
right.
to be able to contact the dead.
Yeah,
Because
that's
it was
right.
that specific time in history where people were open to the idea that there
Absolutely.
was a spirit world and they had lost hundreds of thousands of relatives. And it was
Absolutely.
like, okay, let's talk to young Teddy here if we can.
Yep.
Well, sure, I can set that up for you, but it's not free.
Right. And there was, so there's actually a connection to the Mount because Edith Wharton's very good friend was Henry James, the writer, and Henry James' brother was William James, who was a very early parapsychologist, who did a lot of research into this and was very much involved in that movement.
Yeah, spiritual.
Yeah, so spiritualism, exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? Or any stories? I'd love to hear more. All right, well, thank you so much for being here tonight. And as I said, I have some books available if you'd like to get a copy. And thanks to everyone watching online.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.